So welcome to the webinar. This is how to remember more of what you read. The goal of this workshop is actually to discuss retention. And I want you to know that retention is actually a little bit different than your comprehension. Retention is what you what you remember later on. Your comprehension is what you understand the moment you're reading it. Now, I want you to know the difference because sometimes you could have really good comprehension and absolutely horrible retention. So, for example, you might read a novel, you might be enjoying it, or you might be reading your textbook, you're understanding it, and then the next day you completely forget everything. Think about all those books you read in high school. How many of them do you remember the details? And a lot of times we get the comprehension, but sometimes we struggle with the retention. And here at Iris, although we teach a lot of speed reading classes, I don't want you to think that we're all only about improving people's speed. We want comprehension and retention to improve as well. And that's part of the reason why we're doing these kind of webinars and why we have courses. We have a whole course on comprehension. We have a whole course on memory. What we're going to talk about today are some easy to implement tips that will help you out with your retention almost immediately. We'll also talk about how you can practice and improve your retention if you have a lot of trouble. Let's talk first about situations where we commonly forget things. I want to take a basic example of, remembering people's names. Why is it that it's so easy to forget people's names? For example, I told you my name at the beginning of this webinar, or I had it on the screen, and a lot of people forget very easily. And part of that has to do with the fact that names are abstract. And abstract information is always harder to remember than other types of information like visual information. Let me give you the example between visual and abstract. Visual is, you seeing the person's face. It's funny because we very easily remember the person's face, right? Some people say, oh, I'm really good at remembering faces. Whenever we forget someone's name, let's say you were introduced to them yesterday, later in the week you meet them again, and you get frustrated that you can't remember their name, but the fascinating thing is that you easily remember their face. And why is that? It's because you see the face, you don't see the name. Visual information is always easier to remember. And abstract information is always going to be hard. A good example of this is this thing called the Baker-Baker paradox. This was actually a study that was done where they were trying to see how people's memory would work in two different situations. They took one group of people and they introduced them to a person whose name was Mr. Baker. And they were asked the next day if they could remember what that person's name was. And 90% of the people could not remember that person's name was Mr. Baker. Now, they took another group of people and they were introduced to the same person. And the person told them that he's a baker. That's what he does as his profession. And they asked all those people that were introduced to him the next day, what does this person do for a living? And 90% of them were able to remember very easily that this person was a baker. Now think about why, the word baker. That's why they call it the Baker-Baker paradox. When you're told that a person's name is Mr. Baker, you'll easily forget it. But if you're told that someone is a baker, it's easier to remember. It's because it's visual. Even though that person might not even be dressed up as a baker at that moment, you will visualize in your head. You'll be visualizing maybe what does a baker bake bread? How does a baker look? They've got maybe a top hat, maybe an apron. Maybe there's flour on their hands. There's a certain visual that goes on in your brain, and there's more connections that are made in your brain when you're told this person is a baker. When someone's told, hi, my name is Mr. Baker. Nice to meet you. It's very easy to forget that. So keep that in mind. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because the goal here, if you're going to try and read and remember information, when you're reading very technical material, it comes off as very abstract, and you need to make a mental effort to try to visualize that information. So let me give you an example of how you might go about visualizing the information. You read maybe a paragraph or a section, and then you stop for a moment, maybe 30 seconds or a minute, and you try to think to yourself and you try to visualize the information that you just read. So, if you're reading biology, you might visualize the cells, or you might look at some of the images and pictures and try to get some visualizations going on with respect to what was being discussed in the paragraph. And if you could go through that short, quick mental effort of visualizing the information, you'll be able to remember it a little better. Now, there are some other things that help us remember things. For example, we know it's easy to forget names. because names are abstract. But we know it's easy to remember visual information like a person's face or the fact that they're a baker. But let's think about other situations where our memory actually works really well. You ever hear a song that comes on the radio or it comes on, you haven't heard it in years, but you remember the lyrics to the song? How does that happen? How do songs get stuck in your head? And if you think about it, what happens with music, the reason why it's so memorable is because repetition. Repetition helps you remember things. Think about all the repetition going on when it comes to music and how songs get stuck in your head. Part of it has to do with if you remember all the lyrics to a song, part of it is because you heard that song multiple times in the past. If the song was popular at the time and you heard it on the radio all the time, or maybe it was on your iPod and you were listening to it over and over again, you remember things through repetition. And think about how songs have all this embedded repetition within them. The beat repeats, the melody repeats, certain lyrics and part of the chorus repeats, and all that repetition kind of helps you keep that information in your head. Even though you didn't have to, it's not like you have to study that song once a month to keep it fresh in your head. You could hear the song when it was popular over and over again, and then sometimes 10 years will go by and you'll still remember the lyrics. That's an amazing feat that our brain is doing. Unfortunately, sometimes we get frustrated by our brain and our memory because we forget things so easily. Remember I mentioned earlier about forgetting names? The first step to anything memory related is paying attention. Sometimes we forget a name because we didn't pay attention to begin with. They tell us their name and we were thinking maybe what we were going to say to them and we didn't pay attention to the name. So always pay attention, but also we got to remember that repetition is helping us to remember. So let's think about, as we're reading, what kind of forms of repetition can we get in? Well, one way to do it is obviously to reread your chapter over and over again, but who wants to do that? Nobody wants to reread a chapter. You want to read it once, and you want to read it well and be able to remember the material. So let me talk about some other ways that you can get your repetition in while you're reading. One very simple way is to take notes. If you need to remember your material long term and really well, you definitely want to take some form of note taking. Note taking is a form of repetition, and it helps make those memories of whatever you're studying and learning a little more sticky. They stick in your brain a little longer if you're going to take notes. Now, the interesting thing about taking notes is that you ever take notes and never look at them again? I think we've all had that situation. I remember in high school, sometimes a teacher had all these notes on the blackboard, and I would just write down notes just to let the time pass. And it's funny because they did a study a number of years ago on if you take notes and never look at them again, what's the point of taking notes to begin with? And what they find is even if you take notes and never look at them again, it's still useful. It actually still helps you. Your memory is going to benefit. Why? Because they find that the action of taking notes is a form of repetition. Just the mental effort that it takes to write something down is a form of repetition that helps you remember things. Because as we said earlier, repetition helps you remember. So note taking is a form of repetition. Now, a common question that I get is, well, when should I take notes? Because, should I take notes at the end of every page, at the end of every paragraph, whenever I find something interesting? Let me discuss when you should not take notes. You ever buy a used college textbook and you see a book that has way too much highlighting going on? There's just highlighting all over the place, different colors. I know I've had books like this before. And how does excessive highlighting happen? What happens is someone's reading along, and let's say they're studying for a test that's going to go on tomorrow, and they really need to know the information well. They're reading along and they read something important, so they highlight it. And then they read the next sentence and they feel like, you know what, that's kind of important too. I'm going to highlight that. And then they read the next sentence and they highlight that as well because they feel that's also important. And then they read another sentence and they find out, you know what, this sentence is actually way more important than the last three. I got to highlight this one as well. You already see, they might use a different color at this point because they see it's getting a little ridiculous. This reminds me of a common phrase: when you get caught up in the details, you lose sight of the big picture. This is one of the bigger problems with reading. When people are reading, especially technical information, they get caught up in the details. If you're studying for a test and you need to know a lot of information, you're going to feel like everything's important, so you're going to start taking notes excessively. And what happens is some students, what will happen is they'll read for half an hour, but they spend 45 minutes taking notes. when you take notes, you want to take them, you want to be concise, you want to be effective with your note taking, and you don't want your note taking to take so long that it intrudes on your reading time. So here's when I recommend you should take notes. If you're reading along and you find something interesting, great. Try to continue reading past that one sentence and try to at least finish a paragraph before you take any kind of notes. What I like to do is if I'm reading material that is broken up into, sections, headings, and subheadings, I'll try to wait until I finish a section before I take any notes. And taking notes is also a nice way to give your brain a little break, because when you're taking notes, you're using a different part of your brain than when you're reading the material. So if you have to do a lot of reading, it's definitely a good idea to take notes every so often. One, so you can remember more of what you read, but also so you can take your break, and breaks actually help you to focus over the long term. Now, try to take notes maybe at the end of sections. Wait until you finish maybe a paragraph, but don't take notes every single time you come across something that you think might be important, because sometimes you can read the rest of the paragraph and you might find something even more important. And also keep in mind, you don't have to underline or highlight the entire sentence. Sometimes all you need is a word or a phrase that needs to be highlighted or underlined. And if you're not highlighting or underlining, maybe you're writing notes on a separate page. Maybe you're writing notes in the margins, which leads us to our next slide here. How should I take notes? Well, there's a variety of ways of taking notes. Again, I mentioned you could highlight, you could underline, you can take notes in the margins, you can be doing outlines. Let's discuss outlines real quick, because outlines are a very linear way of taking notes, and we've all seen outlines before, we've done them before, but outlines are very linear and they have some limitations. Here are the limitations. Outlines are very good for sequential information, like history. World War II should come after World War I. But they don't work as well for information that is nonlinear. Nonlinear information would be like, let's say, the topic of marketing. What should be Roman numeral 1 for marketing? I don't know. We could start with advertising because it starts with the letter A. We could talk about word of mouth marketing or internet marketing. There's all these different things involved with marketing. That's a very nonlinear topic. Other topics, there's a lot of nonlinear topics. Law is nonlinear. Physics is nonlinear. There's a lot of different topics that don't necessarily go in a very specific sequence. And this is why taking mind maps as a form of note taking are a very good way to organize information. Let me explain how mind maps work. And you see on your screen right here, this is an example of a mind map where you have a concept in the middle. So let's say you had the topic of physics in the middle, and you might have other topics that are not in any particular order, but they're all related with physics. So you might have, over here we might be talking about Isaac Newton and the laws of motion. Over here we might be talking about Einstein and theories of relativity. Over here we might talk about Richard Feynman and quantum mechanics. You've got string theory. You've got all these things involved with physics. You don't have just a sequence as we have in outlines. And again, you could do this with all sorts of topics. The topic of law. Are we talking about constitutional law? Are we talking about labor law? There's contract law. There's intellectual property law. There's all these different types of law, but they're all involved with the same thing. And keep in mind, for those of you, because some people don't like mind maps because they don't have a linear structure to them. I would argue that you could very easily make a mind map in a linear structure, just not linear, but an ordered structure. Just go clockwise. So if you like using mind maps as a form of note taking, you can start at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. You can go in this kind of clockwise fashion if you need to order your information. But mind mapping is a very linear way of taking notes, and it's important to note that mind mapping, the reason why it's called mind mapping is because it reflects the way your mind works a lot better than linear-based notes like outlines. So keep in mind that if you're going to take notes, mind mapping might be a good option for you. If you take your notes on the computer, here are a few useful mind mapping applications. These are applications that I use. I've looked at a number of different mind mapping applications. These are my two favorite: MindMeister, which is web-based, and Xmind, which is downloadable. If you need something, so web-based, this is useful if you want to store all your mind maps in the cloud, kind of like Google Docs, where you could work on them and share them. We use MindMeister internally here at Iris for brainstorming, project management, doing marketing campaigns. It's a good way to organize information. And the reason why we use the web-based version is because You can easily share a mind map and everyone can work in one place. But I also use Xmind because it's downloadable and I can access it offline. And so and by the way, the difference between these two, and just a full disclosure, we do not get any kind of financial incentive for talking about these applications. These are applications that I use on a daily and weekly basis, so I wanted to recommend them. Xmind is completely free. I think they have a premium version, but the free version is very, very robust, Xmind. And then MindMeister, I think they have a free trial, but then after that, I think it's a few dollars every month. But check these applications out if you're looking for a mind mapping applications. Those I would highly recommend. But again, the reason why we're talking about mind mapping is because generally note taking is a way to remember more of what you read. So remember, repetition helps you remember. What are some other ways that we can get repetition in? Let's talk about another strategy. And now I want to talk about a framework, a process, a way of thinking about how you approach all your reading material. It's called the multiple reading process. It's a 3-step reading process that will help you remember more of what you read. And it starts with a preview. The preview is you getting a big idea of what this article or this chapter is going to be about. So the preview, whatever kind of material you have, just requires you to read maybe the intro and the conclusion to your material. That's how you would do a preview. So for example, let me pull up an article here. On this kind of an article that's just one page, 7 paragraphs, I would simply read the first paragraph and the last paragraph of this article. After doing that, I'm hoping that that intro and conclusion gives me a really good idea of what this article is going to be about. And then I move on to step number 2. Step number 2 is an overview. Now, if you had like a textbook chapter, this is the step where you would be reading all the headings, all the subheadings. You'd be reading boldface words. And if you don't have headings, subheadings, boldface words, you would read the first sentence of every single paragraph. And let me explain why. The first sentence of a paragraph usually is the main idea. It's not always the main idea, but 80% of the time, that first sentence is going to be a topic sentence that tells you, hey, here's what I'm going to tell you about in this long paragraph. And then what happens after that? Then they're going to start telling you about it. You get your details. So we could actually take advantage of the fact that there is this very, very common paragraph structure where you have main idea, details, main idea, details. Let's take this article as an example. Look at the first sentences of, I'm going to zoom in here so you can see it a little easier. Look at the first sentence of every single article, every single paragraph in this article. This article is called India's Skills Famine. The first paragraph says, the economic transformation of India is one of the great business stories of our time. Does that sound like a main idea? Absolutely. So then we would just skip over to the next paragraph and we'd read the first sentence. But India has run into a surprising hitch on its way to superpower status. Its inexhaustible supply of workers is becoming exhausted. Another main point. Look at this paragraph. How is this possible in a country that every year produces 2.5 million college graduates and 400,000 engineers? Okay, another main point. Look at this one right here. There was a time when many economists believed that post-secondary education didn't have much impact on economic growth. Another main idea. Look at this paragraph right here. So we're reading all the first sentences during the overview step. The irony of the current situation is that India was once considered to be overeducated. Another topic sentence. Look at this paragraph right here. First sentence reads, since the Second World War, the countries that have made successful leaps from developing to developed status have all poured money, public and private, into education. Another main point. Look at this paragraph right here. India has taken tentative steps to remedy its skills famine. The current government has made noise about doubling spending on education, and a host of new colleges and universities have sprung up since the mid-1990s. Now, if we look at what we just did here, reading all the first sentences, that shouldn't take you very long. Actually, it took us longer than what it might have because I was actually reading them out loud. If you were reading these to yourselves, it shouldn't take you more than a minute to read 7 sentences. And what do we know now about this article? We've done 2 steps, right? If you preview it, you read the intro and conclusion. Then you overview it and you're reading first sentences in this particular article. Now you know this article is about India, it's about their economy, education is a big theme, they're talking about a skilled labor shortage. All of this information comes up really, really quickly just by doing that. And we spend a little bit of time and we get a lot of information. Now, when I do this process, after the preview and the overview, I ask myself a very important question. Do I want to move on to step number 3? Because step number 3 is read the article or read the material, beginning, to end, finish the whole thing up. Actually, if I was going on this article right here, I probably wouldn't read this beginning part because I read that first paragraph during the preview step. I would just start from here and I would read the rest of the article that I didn't finish up. And sometimes you don't sometimes you do a preview and an overview, these first 2 steps, and you might feel like you know most of the information, and you might feel like maybe you don't have to actually read this article entirely. Maybe your purpose is already fulfilled. Maybe you just wanted to get an idea of what the article was about. Now, let's say you do want to read the article. Well, now what's going to happen to your reading speed? You're probably going to read this article faster because you know what to expect. What's going to happen to your comprehension during the reading step? Well, you're probably going to have better comprehension because you're already prepared for this information to just soak into your brain like a sponge. And the third thing is retention. What are you going to remember? Remember we said earlier, what did we say about repetition? Repetition helps us remember things. Well, look at all the repetition going on here. I'm counting 3 repetitions here: a preview, an overview, a read. And these 3 repetitions, you could actually get more repetitions if you took some notes. And the way you would do this is you would preview. So you read a first and last paragraph, let's say, and then you take some notes. That would be your second repetition. And then you would overview, reading first sentences, and then you would take some notes. That would be a 4th repetition. And then you would read the material and take some notes. That would be a total of 6 repetitions if you took notes after each one of these steps. Now, I know I'm talking in simplistic terms about an article that's just 1 page, 7 paragraphs. But let's say you had material that was structured a little bit differently. Let me take this right here, which is, it's not extremely long material, but it's 2 pages. And this material actually has, you'll notice it has headings, it has subheadings. We've got some bold-faced words going on here. How do we approach this material right here using this? Let me go step by step. Preview. What I would do during the preview is I would read all of this. So the title, obviously, the quote right here, and this first paragraph looks like an introduction. I'm going to read that. And then also during my preview, I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom. Well, if I had this on printed paper, I would not scroll, but I'd be looking at the next page, and I would read the conclusion. Now, for those of you that have similarly structured material, when I say similarly structured, I mean material that has headings, subheadings, bold-faced words. Maybe you got some charts and diagrams. You would do something similar during the preview. You would read your intro and your conclusion, but your intro and conclusion might look a little different than the one I have right here. Your intro might be, it might say objectives if you're reading a textbook, or you might have a little outline there, maybe a case study. Maybe you've got 1 or 2 or 3 pages of maybe you've got actual, content, an actual introduction that's pretty long. You would read that during your preview, and then you'd scroll to the end, or not scroll, but you'd flip over to the end of your long chapter, and you would read your conclusion. Very easy to find a conclusion or a summary at the end of a chapter in a textbook. Sometimes it just says summary. Now, what if you have to do the questions at the end of a chapter? Well, I would probably read those questions before I start reading the entire chapter. Why? Because I want to know what I'm going to be asked for homework. So we do our preview, intro and conclusion. Then we're on the overview. Remember earlier on this article, we were reading the first sentence of every paragraph. Well, on this material, we don't have to read. I wouldn't want to read the first sentence of every paragraph. This material is already structured for me. So for my overview, I'm going to read the headings, the subheadings, bold-faced words. If you have charts and diagrams, look at the titles of those charts and diagrams. So we're selectively reading this material. So I would read, okay, this article is on single tasking and productivity. I would read the problems with multitasking, a single tasking life, how to live a single tasking life. 1, become conscious. 2, clear distractions. 3, choose wisely. 4, put everything you have into an activity. 5, practice. Look at this heading right here, single tasking productivity. It says pick just a few tasks each day. Don't do anything else before doing the first thing on your list of MITs. Clear distractions, 1 task at a time. If you feel the urge to check email or switch to another task, stop yourself. Keep on your MITs until you're done. And if other things come up, note them on a piece of paper or small notebook. Notice how we're just reading small parts of this article during the overview. Now, just by me reading all of those parts out to you, you know what this article is about. You know it's about single tasking, productivity, You saw this word MITs. You'd probably want to know what does that stand for. You'll actually read when you read through this article. You'll actually be able to figure that out very quickly. But the idea here is that we've gone through 3 steps: a preview, an overview, a read. We got a lot of repetition. We know what to expect, and all the information is going to get into our brain a lot easier. The way I want you to think of these first 2 steps right here, preview and overview, think about it like this. What does a professional athlete do before they play a sport? Or any kind of athlete for that matter. They would probably stretch and warm up. And why do they stretch and warm up? Because they want to play at an optimal level when the game begins. Well, think about your reading the same way. If you want to read at an optimal level, you should probably do the reading equivalent of stretching and warming up. And these 2 steps here, preview and overview, are the reading equivalent of stretching and warming up. Why? So we can read at an optimal level. And when I say read at an optimal level, I'm talking about reading with the 3 big areas that we want to improve when we're reading: speed, comprehension, retention. Speed, we want to read faster. Comprehension, we want to understand. Retention, we want to remember. And this process covers all 3 parts. If you know what to expect from the preview and overview, when you read, you'll read faster, you'll understand it better, and because of all this repetition going on, you're going to be able to remember it a lot better than somebody that just reads it beginning to end. So I want you to think about how you can apply this multiple reading process to other types of information. Now, I understand that some people might not want to apply this to, let's say, reading a novel if they don't want to spoil the ending, for example. I'll leave it up to you whether or not you want to apply this to reading novels. There was a study that was done it was actually a little over a year ago out of the University of California, San Diego, that actually showed that spoilers do not spoil stories. What they did was they took 2 different groups of students and they had them read. One group, they told them how the story was going to end. These were mystery novels that had surprise twists at the end. So they told one group what was going to happen at the end. They had them read the ending of the book first, and then they had the other group that just read the book normally from beginning to end. And it turns out the people that knew the ending actually enjoyed it more. In other words, spoilers do not necessarily spoil stories. And what they found was it actually tends to enhance enjoyment. Now, this was a study. I know it was a limited sample. I think they had a few hundred students. You could probably Google the study. But the idea here is that just because you know how it's going to end doesn't mean you're ruining your enjoyment. For example, if you saw the movie Titanic, I'm sure you knew how it was going to end before you walked into that theater or before you saw it. So same thing goes with reading, but I'll leave it up to you whether or not you want to apply this kind of a process to a novel. Now, for informational material, this process works really well, especially for very technical information. Why? Because repetition helps us remember things. Now, how else can we get repetition in? Here's a very simple way to get some repetition in. Talk about what you just read. If you can explain what you just read to somebody and put it in your own words, think about all the mental effort that goes into actually talking about something or teaching a topic to somebody. You have to think how you're going to explain this information. And if you can explain the information, that means, one, you know it well, and that also means that you're also, it's almost like relearning it. I know every time I teach a class, whether it's on the topic of speed reading or comprehension or any other kind of presentation, I feel like I'm relearning that topic and getting, knowing more about it because you're constantly running it through your mind. So keep in mind, if you want to improve your memory of the material, talk about what you just read. This is why study groups can be sometimes very effective. If you read, let's say your textbook chapter and you're talking with other people in your class about what you just read, that can be a very good way to remember the material. So try to talk about what you just read. Now, let's talk about a few other memory-related topics. For example, all of us have probably dealt with mnemonic devices, or you've heard of mnemonic devices. Actually, on the screen, this is a mnemonic device for remembering the sequence of the colors of the rainbow. And mnemonic devices, really what they do is they're almost like shortcuts or quick little tricks to help you remember information quickly, information that you already learned in the past. So this name, Roy G. Biv, each letter stands for one of the colors of the rainbow. Now, this is just one example of a mnemonic device. There are others. So if you ever took a music class or if you play an instrument, you probably learned one of these. The every good boy deserves fudge, or I learned it every good boy does fine, to remember the notes here, or face, as you see right here. Now, that's one mnemonic device that's applied to music. There are other types of mnemonic devices. For example, this is a knuckle mnemonic, where you look at your knuckles. If you're trying to remember how many days are in January, or how many days are in June or May or whatever, you could just look at your knuckles, and each knuckle, if it's a knuckle, it's 31 days. If it's in between one of the knuckles, it's going to be less than 31 days. So January over here is a knuckle, that's 31. In between the next knuckle, we have February, that's obvious, that's the easiest one to remember, 28 or 29. Then we have March, which has 31. Before we get to the next knuckle, we have April, right? That's 30. May, 31. June, that's 30. July, 31. And then August, we have the next knuckle, that's 31. September 30. So on and on, you see how this works. Well, again, mnemonic devices simply help you pull information out of your brain that you already know. But these are like little tricks. If you need to memorize something, one of the ways that you can utilize a mnemonic device, if you're studying business, law, the sciences, whatever you're studying, if you need to kind of remember the information better and you have trouble creating a mnemonic device for yourself to remember it, one of the things I highly recommend you do is just try to do a Google search. Take advantage of the collective wisdom of the internet and search for the terms mnemonic device and then whatever topic you're trying to remember. And chances are you'll find some kind of a blog post or something written on the internet that's already discussing this, because whatever it is you happen to be studying, I'm sure you're not the only person to have ever studied it in the world. So a lot of people wrestle with the same kind of issues, trying to remember this or that. I've worked with nursing students. They had to remember the systems of the body, and they had a mnemonic device for that. And there were mnemonic devices for all the, the parts of the heart. These things, you can Google them, and you can usually find pages of these mnemonic devices. Now, let's move on from mnemonic devices and talk about an exercise that you can do. When I say exercise, I'm talking about practice. When we're talking about remembering more of what you read, there are, tips that you can utilize, like we talked about earlier, writing notes, certain things you can do, but there's also exercises you can do. For example, if you've ever taken one of our live sessions, our speed reading classes, or even our online ones, you know that they're very drill intensive. So there's a lot of drills going on, and the only way you make improvements is if you actually do the drills and practice them. So I want to talk about how you can actually practice and improve your ability to remember what you read. And there's an exercise that you can do to improve your retention. This exercise, I'm going to recommend you try doing it maybe 15 minutes a day for 2 weeks. This is actually not going to be hard to do. If you already read for more than 15 minutes a day, it shouldn't be hard to implement this. You could do this for more than 15 minutes if you want, but I recommend you try doing it 15 minutes a day. Here's what the exercise is. It's called the read and recall exercise, and it helps you improve retention. Here's what you do during the exercise. It's very simple. All you do is, while you're reading, you read a paragraph, and once you're done with that paragraph, you take a quick note about what that paragraph was about. So you take a quick note, and when I say a quick note, I mean a keyword or a phrase, something very quick that you can write down. You could write it down on a separate sheet of paper. You could write it down on part of maybe you're creating a mind map, wherever you want to write it down. But the point is, once you're done reading, you got to think to yourself, what did I just read? And write it down. And then all you got to do is simply rinse and repeat. We read another paragraph, and we do the same thing. Read the paragraph, take a quick note. Read another paragraph, take a quick note. And you're constantly doing this. And what happens is you start forcing yourself to pay attention. One, because you know you have to take a note. And the other thing you're doing is you're constantly quizzing yourself. You're constantly asking yourself, what did I just read? What did I just read? And getting into this habit of constantly thinking, what did I just read, is actually going to improve your ability to retain the information. Now, I recommend that you do this 15 minutes a day for 2 weeks. You don't have to do this indefinitely for the rest of your life, but this kind of an exercise, if you practice it, what you'll find is your ability to retain and recall information, you're going to get better at it. So try to do this exercise if you can. By the way, if you're reading material where every so often you have a very, very short paragraph that's just one sentence long, you don't have to, take a quick note after those, but you want to take notes after all of the longer paragraphs, maybe 3 sentences or more. So try this exercise out for yourself. I think you'll find it very helpful. And if you're interested in the topic of memory and you want to explore it further, we actually have a whole memory course that has 10 class videos. It's got over 7 hours of content that content, you can download it or you could watch it online. And you can check that out at irisreading.com. We actually have a special going on this week. If you go on our website, where you could get a pretty good discount off of all of our online courses, including the memory course. And if you are interested in our other online courses, we've got a course on speed reading, a speed reading mastery course. We've got a comprehension course. We've got a course to help you improve your productivity for the professionals out there that want to squeeze more out of their day. Also, if you have trouble concentrating, we've got a course on how to help you improve your focus. And if you're interested in exploring mind mapping more deeply, you could actually take one of our mind mapping courses. We do these courses also, just so you know, aside from online, we also do them in person. So if you want to invite us to your school or your company or your organization, we'd be happy to do a workshop there. We do workshops in all types of formats: 1 hour sessions, 90-minute sessions, 3 hours. We've done even 1 day, 6 hour intensive programs. So feel free to reach out to us if you have questions about that. And if you have questions for me, here's my contact information. You can reach me by email. If you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, Facebook, or Twitter, feel free. I want to thank you all for attending the webinar. And if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with me. Thank you all again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.